Festival and this particular panel on brain science. I'm so glad to see all of you here, and some of us student members of the audience are joining us from TCMC and the University of Scranton. We're very pleased. There are a lot of things going on this weekend, and we're grateful for your interest in this session. The title of our session is Brain and Culture: How Advances in Neuroscience Are Changing How We Imagine Ourselves. And I think we're having this conversation because neuroscience has emerged a little like the electoral victor in some kind of moderate victory of the center, because it is the confluence of those legendary two cultures which we've worried over for 60 years now. I'm referring to C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures, one humanistic and the other scientific. And all of our panel members before you represent that confluence in one way or another. I'd like to very briefly introduce them. To my extreme right is Adina Roskies, who is at Dartmouth College currently, where she's Associate Professor of Philosophy. Actually, Dr. Roskies holds two PhDs, one in neuroscience and cognitive science from the University of California, San Diego, and the other from MIT in philosophy. And she's the author of numerous articles and public presentations and book contributions, and is working on a text now that she gave me permission to mention to you in public. And I believe I got the title correct: What Color is Your Brain? Michael Graziano, who is in the middle of our threesome, is at Princeton University, a member of the psychology department since, I believe, 2004. And you've been a part of the Princeton community since the mid-'80s, I believe. You did your undergraduate work there. And he sort of embodies the comment that I was making before about the confluence of science and literature. He's worked on the research side on questions of perception and movement, and has a title in which you may have already encountered in the description: The Intelligent Movement Machine. And then also a new thing which is featured in our book offerings on the plaza, and there may be copies here: God, Soul, Mind, Brain, a neuroscientist's reflections on the spirit world. But Michael is also an author of literary fiction and even some children's literature, which he publishes under a pseudonym. And I forgot to ask you how you pronounce it. Is it B.B. Wurge or Wurge?
Wurge. B.B. Wurge.
B.B. Wurge.
He writes the children's books.
That's an interesting matter. But also the love song of Monkey, which is a novel and available. The Seclusion Zone, The Divine Farce. These are novellic offerings, and so Michael has enjoyed success as an author of fiction as well. Jonathan Gottschall beside me is with us from Washington and Jefferson College in Washington, Pennsylvania. Washington County is in the extreme opposite corner of the Commonwealth. He finished his PhD in the neighborhood at the University of Binghamton University, SUNY Binghamton, about an hour north of here, in English. And he has written a very well-received study of the poetry of Homer, particularly the Iliad, which has to do with the question of violence in the Iliad, and as seen from a literary Darwinist point of view. And there are other titles as well. That one is called The Rape of Troy. Literature, Science, and the New Humanities, which also goes to this question of bringing the two cultures together. And then a reader on film, evolution, literature, and film. And he is the editor and contributor to The Literary Animal, Evolution and the Nature of Narrative. If I got that,
you did.
That correct.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. The way we'll proceed is Adina will start us. I'm sorry. Michael will start us out, and Adina, I think you're following up. And then Jonathan, we're going to keep our time in 15-minute segments. And it won't be the law of the Medes and the Persians, but it will allow for some time in the end for questions from all of you, our friends who've gathered. So we hope to include you in a conversation, and that part will be the beginning of some ongoing interaction. All right. Michael, please.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you very briefly today about a very cosmic, esoteric topic, consciousness, human consciousness. And I'm a neuroscientist. I've spent the last 20 years at Princeton University studying how the brain processes sensory input, how it controls movement. But lately I've become more interested in the really big question of neuroscience. How does the brain produce consciousness? And not to be shy about the importance of this question, I would say that there are three really gigantic scientific realizations that have shaped us philosophically, that inform us about who we are and our relationship to the world around us. And the first of these major scientific realizations was the Copernican revolution. Belief systems had assumed that people were at the center of the universe. And the Copernican revolution blows that out of the water and tells us that we're just a speck in a much larger cosmos. Clearly a major realignment of the way people think about ourselves. The second giant scientific realization of this nature was Darwinian natural selection. So again, belief systems had assumed that animals and people were special, separate, intentional acts of creation of a deity. Then Darwin discovered that there's a simple natural phenomenon that can, in principle, explain the diversity of life on Earth, and in particular our own existence and our own form. So clearly something that shook up the way people thought philosophically about ourselves and about our relationship to the world around us. And the third of these giant scientific advances I would say in the history of science is happening right now in neuroscience, and that's the gradual piecing together of how the brain produces consciousness. And the reason why I put that at such a high elevation among the big three is because this lies at the center. It's the linchpin of the philosophy of materialism. Scientific materialism is this idea that there is no spirit world, that the universe is not divided into a spirit world and a physical world. It's all one natural world. And consciousness, this thing that we all experience, is a product of natural processes in the brain. And this philosophy, according to this philosophy, when the brain ceases to function, your consciousness ends. There's no life after death. There's no ghosts. There's no spirits. There can't be a mind without a biological brain. There's no deities. There's no God. There's no spirit world at all. And this entire philosophy rests on this one hypothesis, that consciousness is a product of natural processes in the brain. Now, this is a very old hypothesis. Hippocrates actually wrote about it more than 2,000 years ago. But in some ways, it's also a weak hypothesis because, at least until now, there's been no logical, plausible mechanism to account for how the machinery of the brain could possibly produce this ineffable feeling of awareness. And lacking a mechanism, the hypothesis is not entirely convincing. It leaves open the possibility for philosophers to say, well, no, I disagree. I think there is a spirit world. I think human consciousness is part of the spirit world. I think it does not emerge from the brain. If you think it does emerge from the brain, show me the mechanism. In fact, in many ways, the situation of the brain basis of awareness resembles the situation with evolutionary theory before Darwin. The idea of evolution was around, people talked about it, but Darwin provided a specific plausible mechanism for it to happen and breathed scientific life into it. And so in a sense, neuroscience is in need of a specific mechanism for how awareness can emerge from the machinery of the brain. And if this were possible to work out through scientific study, in this context, it would have enormous seismic implications, philosophically, religiously, scientifically, culturally. And I don't mean simply elevating materialism or knocking down religion. I mean that the answer to this riddle might turn out to surprise both sides of that debate. Now, there are many different hypotheses that have been proposed in neuroscience for how the brain might produce consciousness. And there's something of a scientific controversy. However, there's two basic kinds of directions that people have taken. And one general direction is the more popular one. Almost all the specific hypotheses about the brain basis of consciousness fall into this one category. And this particular direction of thinking, I would say, actually is probably, it seems to be fatally logically flawed. I think it's extremely unlikely to be correct. There's a second way of thinking, a second direction of thought, which is much more plausible to me and seems more likely to be correct. And actually, this second way of thinking is what I wrote about in the book that Bill mentioned. Anyway, let me tell you just a little bit first about the direction of thought that is much more popular in neuroscience right now. And the idea basically is the brain processes information. It's a little bit like a computer in some ways. It processes information, and somehow when information is passed through the right circuit or it goes through the right process, something else happens and awareness emerges. And we become aware of the information. And this way of thinking divides the physical machine with information in it from this side product of being aware of the information. And in this way of thinking, the question is, what is that trick? What is the little neuron trick that makes consciousness emerge so that we're aware of that information? And there are many different specific hypotheses, like, for instance, one is that when neurons process information and those neurons oscillate, so neurons have activity and that activity can oscillate. If it oscillates 40 times per second approximately, that produces awareness. It's a very interesting hypothesis. There was some evidence that led people a little bit in that direction, but it's actually not a very good explanation in the sense that it doesn't really explain. It doesn't explain why oscillations of that nature would produce this particular phenomenon of awareness. It doesn't bridge the gap from the machine to this floating side product of awareness. Another hypothesis was information is cycled from the cortex, this is the outer layer of the brain, to deeper structures and then back up to cortex. And as the information is cycled, one becomes aware of that information. Another interesting hypothesis, but it suffers from the same problem. It doesn't explain why the heck that process of cycling information would result in this weird feeling of being aware of the information. So there's a gap there. And there are many other hypotheses about what are often called the neural correlates of consciousness. And many of these hypotheses suffer from the same problem. And the problem is that this framework of thinking is what's called dualistic. There's a division between the machine with its information in it and this side product that emerges from the machine, the awareness. And the problem of separating those is that it's very hard to figure out how you get from the machine to the feeling of awareness. It's very hard to pinpoint what the mechanism, what the logic might be for getting from one to the other. But even more so, and this is the really fatal problem with this approach, there's no mechanism for getting back the other direction. There's no mechanism for this ineffable feeling of awareness to have a specific direct control over the machine and alter our behavior. And so awareness of this type, consciousness of this type would be what's called an epiphenomenon. It would simply float there in your head, notice what you were doing, be aware of what you were doing, but have no impact on your behavior. And we know this can't be true. Because if there's one thing we know about consciousness, it's about the only thing we absolutely know for sure, is that we can talk about it. I can tell you I'm conscious, and I can describe to you that one experience is very vivid, in my inner conscious experience is vivid, another experience may be less vivid. I can tell you a little bit about it. Speech is controlled by muscles, muscles are controlled by neurons, neurons are controlled by information in the brain. So whatever consciousness is, whatever this thing is that we're all talking about, it must be able to have a specific controlling impact on the neural machinery itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to talk about it. And this begins to lead us in this other direction, this more promising direction. And to describe that, I would say, to summarize it, I would say, in this second way of thinking, which I think is more likely to be true, consciousness, awareness, these things are information. It's not that we become aware of information. The awareness itself is information. And I say that because when I tell you, I'm aware of this object, I'm aware of that object, I'm aware of myself, I'm conveying information. When I say sunlight on green grass gives me a very vivid inner experience of green, I'm conveying information to you. Something in my brain must have computed that information and made it available, otherwise I wouldn't be able to report it. And so we have a totally different view of consciousness, that there must be an expert system in the brain that computes information about its own mental state and makes it available so that we can report on it. And in that direction of thinking, the question becomes, what structures in the brain compute information about one's own mental state, about mental states in general? And it turns out that there are areas in the brain that seem to specialize in that. These have actually been known for a long time and studied for years, structures in the brain that specialize in building up information about somebody else's mind. And the study of these structures is called social neuroscience. And what we do, there are particular areas in the brain that seem to emphasize this function. These regions of the brain build up information about somebody else, like what the person's thinking, what the person's aware of, what experiences the person might be having. All that information is bundled together and we attribute it to the other person's mind. This is called social perception. We do it all the time. And the theory here is that the same brain areas are building an informational model of a mind and attributing it to ourselves. And consciousness, therefore, is a perception. It's a perception of mind. And it's the same kind of stuff that we do when we look at other people and perceive mind in other people. So consciousness as an informational bundle in the brain, consciousness as a perceptual model. This is as I said, a direction that seems to be much more promising. And so there is some possibility there that we may be getting closer, neuroscience may be getting close to understanding, at least in basic outline, how the physical machinery of the brain, how its computing power could produce something like the ineffable feeling of awareness or consciousness. And I'll end there because I think I've run out of my time. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll have an opportunity to return to the themes you brought up. Adina, would you take the floor?
Sure. Can I just invite the people standing in the back to come up, because there are plenty of seats. So this would be a good time.
1, 2,
I know, we
3,
don't
4,
bite.
5, 6, 7, 8. I think we have room. There are 2 right here.
That was really interesting. I wanted to actually just maybe respond to something that Michael said that I think is worth bearing in mind. I'm a big fan of materialism, the view that there's really only one kind of thing. And so everything that we experience and everything we think about ultimately gets explained in those terms. But just, I think, to be completely honest about how these sort of philosophical questions are influenced by the science, it's not the case that anything that science will ever tell us will disprove the possibility of dualism. So the reason that I think probably all of us here, maybe, are materialists is because we think it's the best explanation for what we see, and that the things that we haven't yet explained, we will be able to explain in terms of how the physical stuff in the universe works. But there isn't anything that science is going to be able to tell us that rules out the possibility that there is something else, be it God, spirit, mind, etc. The best that we can hope for as materialists is that we will have everything we need to explain everything we see, and so there won't be any need to invoke something else. But there's not going to be anything that disproves that there is something else, at least. That I take it as sort of the philosophical limits of what science can do. But that said, I think that, so you could say, well, okay, nothing science can tell us can really even influence anything we think about God or mind or will, et cetera. And I think that's not true, because I really do think that there are explanations that are very compelling. And so the things that I wanted to talk to you about today are maybe just secondary to consciousness as major issues for the way we think of ourselves as human. One is free will, and I can include in free will this issue of how do we make decisions. So that's part of what it is, presumably, to act and will freely. And then the question of how do we, what is ethics? How do we make moral judgments? And then some more real world implications of what the neuroscience might have. So with respect to free will, there's been a lot of attention lately on some studies, both in psychology and in neuroscience, that I think influence the way we think about free will. And a lot of people think that they have shown that there is no such thing as free will. I disagree with that, but I do think that they make implausible certain kinds of views about what it would be to have free will if we had it. So first, let me sketch really briefly what the philosophical picture of free will is, or what the various philosophical options are, and then tell you about what the science tells us. So historically, the question of whether or not we are free has been framed in terms of the question of whether the universe is deterministic or not. So it seems intuitive to most people that if everything that happens is determined, that is, if there's only one way that the world could be given the way the world is at any time and the laws of nature, so that the next step in time has to be this next particular way, that nobody would have free will, and that would be the end of the story. And so that has been the way that people have framed this question of freedom. Is the universe deterministic? Are our brains deterministic? And some people think that either neuroscience that shows that neurons don't seem to act deterministically can show that, in fact, we are free, or that quantum mechanics shows that, in fact, we are free. And I think none of this is the case. I think, in fact, that thinking about freedom in terms of determinism or indeterminism is kind of a red herring. So there are, I think, compelling arguments that you can have free will in a deterministic universe, because I don't think that the question of freedom really rests on the question of determinism. So that just sort of sets the stage. So there are people who are incompatibilists, who think that freedom is incompatible with determinism, and there are people within that category who think it's probably the case that everything's determined, so we're not free. And there are other people who think it's not the case that everything's determined, so we probably are free. You could think, actually, those people have a problem, right? Because if what isn't determined is random, and the reason that we choose option A over option B is only, the flip of a coin, or the quantum state of some atom in our brain, then that's not what freedom is either, right? Because we don't have control over what is happening there. So that doesn't seem to be compatible with freedom either. And then there are those people, and I'm one of them, who think, you know what, it doesn't really matter whether the universe is deterministic. Freedom resides in other kinds of things. So at the very end, I'll tell you what I think freedom is about. There have been some really interesting neuroscientific studies that have made people think regardless of the question of freedom, that there are bigger problems that we have. And one is that this series of studies by a guy named Benjamin Libet, who died recently, and he did a really simple thing. He just asked people to sit there and move their finger whenever they wanted to. And he recorded from their scalp, and so he got electrical signals that were happening in the brain. You could tell if you put an electrode on your scalp. And he found that before people moved their finger, there was a little blip in their scalp recordings that sort of predicted that they were going to move a few milliseconds later. In fact, it was about 500 milliseconds later, so half a second later, after there was a blip, they moved their finger. And so that, in and of itself, doesn't mean, okay, we're no longer free, just because you can see some sign of an impending activity, right? It could be that that little blip was when we decided to move our finger. But then he did this really interesting thing, and he had them do this experiment while he was recording, while they watched a circle moving around a clock face. And what they had to do was report to the experimenter when they felt the urge or made the decision to move their finger. So where in this clock was that dot when they decided to move their finger or when they felt the desire or the urge to move their finger? And it turned out that that was only about 300 milliseconds before the movement. So the situation that he found is that there's a brain signal at 500 milliseconds before the movement, and then about 200 milliseconds later, the person said, and that's when I decided. And then after that, they moved the finger. And so now the worry is that we don't actually do the deciding. There's something in our brain that's making us decide, and then we move our finger. And people have been really, really worried about this. I actually find it a little bit puzzling, but one thing that it suggests, though, is that there's certainly something that happens before we decide, or it happens before we know we decide, or we are aware that we decide. But I think what it really shows is exactly what you would expect if you believed that materialism was true. That is, that there's some kind of brain process that has to occur before you can do anything, including decide, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not free or we're not deciding freely when we decide. It just means that what it is to decide freely is for a certain kind of brain process to occur. So if you really believe in materialism or physicalism, the idea that everything we do, everything we are really comes from the physical world, then it seems like there's nothing really incompatible. What does seem incompatible is our intuitive notion that what it is to make any decision has to begin with consciousness of what we're doing. And so I think that kind of idea is threatened. But if you think about it, that kind of idea is completely at odds with everything we believe about how the physical world works, right? I mean, unless you believe that there was some other non-mental stuff, then it would have to be the case that something would happen in the physical world that would constitute what it is to make a decision or to be aware of something or to act freely. So although I don't think that this kind of experiment really challenges our notions of free will, I think that they appear to challenge it if we're not very aware of exactly what a materialist universe would involve, right? But so if you have an idea that the only way you could possibly be free is if physicalism is false, then it challenges it just because it seems like another obvious prediction of physicalism that you would see something of this sort. And it does turn out, and this, I think, actually does at least put pressure on our intuitive notions of freedom, that quite a lot of what we do without knowing what we're doing. When we make decisions, there are factors that influence our decisions that we're not aware of. Marketers have gotten to be very savvy about this. It turns out if you, I can't remember exactly what the detail is, but if you are selling stockings or something, and if you put them on the right side versus the left side of the display, people buy a lot more if they're on the right versus the left. Right now, that's totally irrational. It's totally arbitrary. Why should that make any difference about whether or not you buy the stockings? So there are some kind of factors that we're not aware of when we decide, but that doesn't mean that we had no choice but to buy those stockings or anything that threatens the notion of freedom. How am I on time?
A couple more.
Couple more minutes? Okay, so let me leave freedom for now. I think there's a lot of fascinating work in neuroscience that's trying to get at what are these processes of volition. There's some recent studies that suggest that there are factors in the brain that give you some kind of predictive power over future decisions, like decisions 10 seconds in the future, that you think are arbitrary, but in fact, you can be slightly better than chance at predicting what decision somebody will make by measuring activity in a certain brain area. But again, I think all that means, that doesn't mean we aren't free. It just means that we're physical systems and there are some processes that are happening in these physical systems that have some bearing on the way we act in the future, which is, kind of what you would expect. It might be surprising that it's 10 seconds in the future if it is that long, but there's some reasons to doubt that that's actually in fact the case. So the other question is moral judgment. So what are ethics? Now, some people have the idea that, again, I think is mistaken, that you couldn't possibly have ethical decisions or right or wrong or anything if there weren't a God to tell you what was right and what was wrong. I'm going to leave aside that question and talk more about the kind of ethical theories that people have suggested over the years. And there are a number of them, but there are two main categories of ethical theories. One is called consequentialism, and another is called deontology. There are some others that I'm leaving out, but consequentialism, utilitarianism is one example of consequentialism. And it's the idea that what makes things right or wrong is what the consequences are. So if they lead to good consequences, if they lead to more happiness, they're right. If they lead to pain, unhappiness, suffering, etc., they're wrong. So that's essentially what consequentialism holds. And deontology has this view, instead of the consequences being what matters, that there are certain kinds of principles, rights, duties, etc., things that we owe to others, rules that shouldn't be broken, that govern morality. And some of the interesting things that have been done recently in brain sciences is that people are starting to look at what happens when people make moral decisions. And one of the, actually this originated in Princeton, but one of the, I think, most famous studies now was done by Joshua Green, who was at Princeton then, and Jonathan Cohen. And they had people make decisions about this trolley problem. So the trolley problem is there's this trolley coming down the track, and the trolley's about to hit 5 people, and you're standing there right near a switch that can either, if you do nothing, let the trolley hit the 5 people, or you can flip the switch and shove the trolley down another track where there's only 1 person. So you can save the 5 by killing the 1, right? Do you flip the switch or not? So how many people would flip the switch? Here. Most people, right? Because you're all things equal, you don't know anything about these people. You could either kill 5 people, or you could kill, or you could save the 5 and kill the 1, or you could let 5 die. There's another scenario, though. So you're standing on a bridge over the track. The trolley's coming at the 5 people. You're standing on the bridge. There's a fat man right in front of you. You realize that the trolley's going to hit the 5 people if you don't do something. And you realize if you push the fat man onto the track, he'll stop the trolley, but he will die. So you could kill the fat man, Sorry, I know it's politically incorrect, but this is in fact how this was originally written. Do you push the fat man off the bridge or not? How many would do that? Some people, but many fewer, which is pretty typical. And the question is, what makes the difference, right? Now it seems like if all that matters are the consequences are the same. So, was that a time thing?
No, but how about a minute and a half?
A minute and a half, okay. The consequence, oh, okay. Anyway, so interestingly, we've had these two different ethical views, one saying what matters are the consequences, and the other saying that what matters is something else. That is some sense of right or duty or things that are not, just not permissible. And if you look at what happens in people's brains when they make these kinds of decisions, there is some evidence that there are different kinds of systems operative in your brain that are kind of responding to the same kinds of considerations as these two different kinds of ethical theories. And so that, for one thing, kind of gives an explanation for why we've had many hundreds of years of debates about which is the right ethical theory, because there are aspects in us that seem to work according to the kinds of principles that these ethical theories have, and in certain cases they end up opposed. And in fact, when you have trouble making that kind of decision, what might be happening is that you've got these subsystems in your brain that are saying, no, you can't push the fat man off the bridge, but it's much better to save 5, right? So you've got these little kind of warring systems in your brain that are trying to struggle to work out what it is that you should do. So I think this is really interesting. The other thing that is also interesting, and this is a very rough pass and should not be taken entirely seriously, but if you look at what those systems are, the ones that are pushing you to just pay attention to the numbers are areas in the brain that are also involved in things like calculation and rational thought. And if you look at parts of the systems that are saying, no, you can't push the fat man, those are involved in emotional responses. And so that kind of accounts for that gut feeling like, oh, no, you can't push the fat man, right? So it's just very interesting, and it gives a way of reconciling our ethical intuitions with a story of how different subsystems in our brain work. So I'm going to close by moving to one final thing that talks about, that sort of incorporates this, and that is the criminal law. So how do these kinds of views, questions about our freedom of will, questions about how we make ethical judgments, how does this impact the way that our legal system works or the way that it should? And so for the question session, I'm just going to put out a case for you, and just so you get the sense of what kinds of questions we are going to be grappling with. And that is, there was a guy, seemingly normal guy, who all of a sudden, after a perfectly normal life, started collecting pornography, feeling like he just really wanted to look at porno magazines, and he started having feelings for his stepdaughter, and eventually he made an advance on his stepdaughter, and his girlfriend, the mother, took him to the authorities, and he went into a rehab program, and during this course of the rehab program, he just couldn't complete the requirements, and in fact started propositioning the people who were running the program. He just seemed to be completely unable to control his sexual impulses. And so he failed out of the program and was sentenced to jail term. And on the way to jail, he said, my head really hurts. And when he finally convinced somebody that he wasn't just lying, and they took him to a neurologist, they found a big tumor. And they took out this tumor, his headache went away, and so did all of these perverse sexual desires. And after he recovered, he went back to his normal life. He was fine for a few years, And then a couple of years later, he started feeling this urge to collect pornography again, and he told somebody about it, and they did a brain scan, and the tumor had regrown. And so, you know, it's clear that there are biological factors that influence things like, you know, our desires and our behavior, and make certain behaviors seemingly unable to be controlled. And once we know these kinds of things, what are we going to do with our concepts of criminal responsibility, culpability, punishment? How should the law, if at all, adjust to these kinds of new forms of knowledge? So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Adina. Thank you very much. Jonathan.
Ready to go? Okay. You're off the hook. I told Michael that I was going to do an interpretive dance in the presentation, but there's kind of a lot of people here, so I kind of lost my nerve. So Michael's going to help, but I'm gonna. Thanks for having me. This is great, and thanks to everybody for coming. I'm going to be talking today about a book that'll be coming out next year. It's supposed to be called Mapping Neverland, but my editor is getting nervous about that because they think maybe it'll be a book about Michael Jackson. Yeah. So it might be called Mapping Wonderland before all is said and done. It's a book about science and storytelling. I'm going to read a little bit from it right now. Statisticians agree that if they can only net some immortal monkeys and lock them up in a room with a typewriter and get them to furiously thwack at the keys for a long, long time, the monkeys will eventually flail out a perfect reproduction of Hamlet, with every period and comma and zablud in its proper place. It's important that the monkeys be immortal. Statisticians admit that it'll take a long, long time. Other scientists are skeptical. In 2003, British scientists arranged a pilot test of the infinite monkey theory. Pilot because researchers still don't have troops of deathless super monkeys or the infinite time horizon required for a decisive test. But they did have an old computer, and they did have 6 Sulawesi crested macaques. They put the machine in the monkey's cage and closed the door. The monkeys stared at the computer. They circled it warily. They tried to kill it with rocks. They squatted over the keyboard, tensed and voided their waists. They picked up the keyboard to see if it tasted good. It didn't, so they hammered it on the ground and screamed. They began poking keys slowly at first, then faster, much faster. The researchers sat back in their chairs and waited, stroking their calculators meditatively. A whole week rushed by, and then another, and still the lazy monkeys had not written Hamlet, not even the first scene. But they had produced 5 pages of text, which the proud researchers folded in a handsome leather binding and gave it the title, Notes Towards the Complete Works of Shakespeare, which I quote from at random. Safga, asvaga, mofaza, sa. The experiment's most notable discovery was that Sulawesi crested macaques greatly prefer the letter S to all other letters in the alphabet, though the full implications of this discovery are not yet known. The study's lead investigator soberly concluded that the work was interesting, but had little scientific value, except to show that the infinite monkey theory is flawed. So in short, it seems that the great dream of every statistician, of one day reading a copy of Hamlet, handed over to them by an immortal super monkey, is just a pipe dream, a lovely, lovely pipe dream. So what's the point of this little story? It's that monkeys don't do story. Only people do story. And my question is, one of the questions I'm sort of obsessed with right now is why that is. And you might think it's a very obvious question. Duh, you might say. It's because story gives us joy. But that's not really an answer. That just changes the question to this. Why does story give us joy? If you think about it, evolution is a ruthlessly utilitarian process. So how has the seeming luxury of fiction not been eliminated from the human repertoire? After all, every time you plop down with Hamlet or Harry Potter or Harlequin romance, you are not doing any of the evolutionary useful things those books are about. Battling villainy, grubbing for prestige, wooing and fornicating, and so on. So I'll be talking today about how insights from the brain sciences are being used to explore a riddle about human nature that is really big, but it is also so basic that it hides in plain sight. Human life is all wrapped up in story, shot through by a story. It's dominated by it. Why are we creatures of story? Let's begin by imagining an aircraft carrier at sea. Navy fighter pilots have many hard jobs. Perhaps the hardest is landing a 50-ton airplane laden down with jet fuel and high explosives on a 500-foot runway that is skimming across the ocean at up to 30 knots. The aircraft carrier is immense and powerful, but the ocean is much more so. And the whole runway moves with the swell. The aircraft carrier is specced with people and planes. The belly of the huge ship holds 5,000 souls, a terrible array of missiles and bombs, and a nuclear reactor. Navy pilots have to land on this thread of moving concrete in all weather conditions into the black of night. They have to do so without wrecking their planes, killing their shipmates, or causing a nuclear disaster. So the Navy has developed sophisticated methods for training aviators to land at sea. Before letting young pilots try their hands at actual landings, they strap into flight simulators that provide much of the benefit of practicing real takeoffs and landings without the potential carnage and hellfire of the real thing. There's a psychologist named Keith Oatley, who hypothesizes that stories are the flight simulators of human life. Just as flight simulators allow pilots to train safely, stories safely train us up for the big challenges of the human condition. Like a flight simulator, fiction projects us into vividly realistic simulations of dilemmas that run parallel to those we face in the real world. And like a flight simulator, a main virtue of fiction is that we have a rich virtual experience and we don't die at the end. We get to simulate what it would be like, say, to confront a powerful villain or seduce a man's wife, and the hero of the story dies in our stead. So we go to stories because we enjoy them, but nature has designed us to enjoy stories because we get the benefits of practice. It's an interesting theory. Is there any evidence for it? At this point, no, not very much. Science is about repeated rounds of speculation and refutation, and when it comes to the question, why story, we are very much in the stage of speculation, not refutation. And there are other viable ideas about why we tell stories that may also turn out to be right in whole or in part. But the evidence that makes the flight simulator theory plausible comes mainly from the brain sciences, and that's why I'll be talking about it today. The television show I'm watching cuts to a commercial. It's an ad for the National Football League. A small boy is racing in slow motion over green grass straight into my living room. The boy is just beaming, tossing glances, semi-scared, semi-delighted, at someone or something out of frame. Suddenly, a huge and handsome young man, a defensive lineman for the Houston Texans, sweeps in from stage left. He scoops the giggling boy up like a football, cradling the boy under one arm. The man runs at the camera, still in slow-mo. The man and the boy are both smiling to crack their faces. Sitting alone in my living room, I can't help but smile too, so broadly that it squeezes tears into my eyes. Mirror neurons were discovered quite by accident by Italian neuroscientists in the 1990s. The neuroscientists had implanted electrodes directly into a monkey's brain. They wanted to know which brain areas were responsible for, say, commanding a monkey's hand to reach out and grab a nut. And in short, the scientists found that the same areas of the monkey's brain would activate not only when the monkey grabbed a nut, but whenever the monkey saw someone else grab a nut. In the 15 years or so since these early experiments, there's been a flood of research on mirror neurons. And this research shows that there are networks of neurons in the brain that fire not only when we perform an action or experience an emotion, but whenever we see someone else perform an action or experience an emotion. We understand what's going on in each other's brains by simulating it at a neuronal level, by mirroring their brain state in our own. Mirror neurons explain how mental states can be contagious. They explain what happened to me when I saw that NFL ad. Just seeing the goofy smiles on the faces of the boy and the man triggered an automatic response in my own brain, one that spread out to the smile on my face and the tears in my eyes. I literally caught their joy. Mirror neurons seem to be the neurological basis for our ability to run fictional simulations in our heads. One of the pioneers of this research, a scientist named Marco Iacoboni, writes that movies feel so authentic to us because mirror neurons in our brain, I'm quoting, recreate for us the distress we see on the screen. We have empathy for the fictional characters. We know how they're feeling because we literally experience those same feelings ourselves. And when we watch the movie stars kiss, some of the cells firing in our brain are the same ones that fire when we kiss our lovers. So back to my own text. We know from lab studies that stories affect us physically, not just mentally. When the protagonist is in a tight corner, we breathe faster, we sweat more. When we watch a scary movie, we will cringe defensively when the victim is attacked. When the hero brawls with the villain, we may do a little dance in our seats as though to avoid blows. We writhe and suffer and weep at Sophie's choice. We laugh at Candide until it hurts. We gulp and sweat during the worst scenes in Psycho, watching between our fingers. And the trauma we experience is so real that we may stick to baths for months to come. But knowing fiction is fiction, the fact that we know it consciously, knowing that fiction is fiction, doesn't stop the emotional brain from treating it as real. That's why we have such a powerfully stupid urge to scream at the heroine of the slasher film, drop the phone and run, for God's sakes, run. In fact, we respond so naturally to fictional stimuli that when psychologists want to study an emotion like sadness in the lab, they frequently use clips from movies like Old Yeller or Love Story to jerk tears out of their subjects. Our responses to fiction are just now beginning to be studied at the brain level. fMRI scans of brains on fiction show that when we see something scary or sexy or dangerous in a film, our brains light up as though that thing were actually happening to us and not just to a cinematic or novelistic figment. For example, in a Dartmouth brain lab, people watch scenes from the Clint Eastwood spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, while their brains were being scanned by an fMRI machine. The scientists discovered that viewers' brains caught the emotions that were being enacted on the screen. When Clint is angry, the viewer's brains look angry too. When the scene is sad, the viewer's brain also looks sad. In a similar study, scientists placed research subjects in an fMRI scanner while they showed them a short film clip of an actor drinking from a cup and then making a disgusted face. They also scanned subjects while they read a short scenario, asking them to imagine walking down the street, accidentally bumping into a retching drunk and catching some of the vomit in their own mouth. Yeah, your brain's lighting up right now.
Yes.
And finally, the scientists scanned the subjects' brains while they actually tasted disgusting solutions. In all three cases, the same region of the brain lights up, the anterior insula, the seat of the sensation of disgust. As one of the scientists put it, what this means is that whenever we see a movie or read a story, the same thing happens. We activate our bodily representations of what it feels like to be disgusted. And that is why reading a book and viewing a movie can make us literally feel what the protagonist is going through. These studies are consistent with the flight simulator theory of fiction. They suggest that when we experience fiction, our brains are being put through a realistic simulation. Our neurons are firing in something like the way they would fire if we were actually faced with Sophie's choice, or if we were taking a relaxing shower and a stab-happy psycho suddenly ripped the curtain down. Based upon what we know about simulation, the practice, and other domains, it seems plausible that our constant immersion in fictional problem solving could improve our ability to deal with real problems. If this is so, fiction would do so by literally rewiring our brains. It's an axiom of neuroscience that cells that fire together wire together. When we practice a skill, we improve because repetition of the task establishes denser and more efficient neural connections. This is why we practice, to lay down grooves in the brain, making our actions surer, crisper, faster. So does practicing on fiction actually make us more perfect? That's sort of the gold standard here about whether this idea is true or not. And there's some evidence that it does. There's a few studies by this guy I mentioned earlier named Keith Oatley, and he was able to control for differences in personality traits and gender and age and IQ and things like this. And he still finds that people who consume a lot of fiction tend to outperform non-fiction readers on tests of social ability and empathy. Note that this finding is not really self-evident because, if anything, the cultural stereotype of a nerdy bookworm or an introverted couch potato would lead us to expect that exposure to fiction degrades social abilities, not improves them. So I'll quickly sum up the main idea here. It's that fiction stories are a powerful and ancient virtual reality technology that simulates the big dilemmas of human life. When we pick up a book or turn on the TV, whoosh, We're projected into a virtual world. We then identify so closely with the characters that we don't just sympathize with them, we strongly empathize with them. We feel their happiness and their pain and their fear. We sweat with our heroes, we pant with them, we become sexually aroused with them. Our brains rev up as though what is happening to them were actually happening to us. This constant firing of our neurons in response to fictional stimuli may have real wiring consequences in our brain. We strengthen and refine the neural pathways that lead to efficient navigation of life's dilemmas. From this point of view, humans are attracted to fiction, not because of the accidents of evolution, but because fiction is on the whole good for us. The pleasure of fiction is the brain responding appropriately to a wholesome stimuli. Fiction is good for us because human life, especially social life, is intensely complicated and the stakes are very high. Fiction allows our brains to practice reactions to the kinds of problems that are, and always were, most crucial to our evolutionary success. And just one question, one point about dualism. The question about dualism, about sort of a material world and a spirit world, is very much something that I deal with in my work too, because storytelling, different forms of art, are often seen as sort of the last bastion, the last refuge of spirit, the last place where materialist science cannot, should not penetrate and explain away wonder. And so the work I do makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I don't think mystery disintegrates, wonder disintegrates because you can explain something or try to explain something. A novel doesn't get less beautiful if we understand something about the evolutionary basis of storytelling. My friend, the literary scholar Brian Boyd, I'll end with a very quick quote from him. He says, he studies the same sort of stuff I do. He says, "Science may help explain why art has come to matter, but that will not give science art's emotional impact, nor allow it to find a formula for art, nor make it matter less. If anything, science will only clarify why and how art matters so much." That's all I have, so thank you very much for listening.
We'll include our audience.
That's good.
Friends, we'd like to interact and hear some questions from you. If you would be succinct, then I'll try to do some justice calling on everyone who wishes to speak. Yes, sir.
Yes, and earlier in my life there was a movement called the New Age movement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. I have to admit I was a victim of the New Age movement for many years, and I did participate in a variety of activities. I kept lucid dream journals. I did hundreds of tarot. I fact, I had a professional tarot practice. I read voluminously in esoteric Hindu philosophy as well as American spiritualist philosophy. I also was a daily meditator. I still am, practicing a wide variety of meditations. I practiced a whole bit, automatic writing, things of that nature. In any case, I then was stricken with a severe case of historical materialism after I started reading Karl Marx. My subjective life has not been as interesting since then, but nonetheless, I do remember the time. It did prove some interesting features to it. The question I have is this. A person during that period of time, the New Age movement in the 70s, named Jane Roberts, produced voluminous works. Zeth Speaks was very popular in the 70s. A variety of Zeth books, a wonderful poet and a novelist. And she did much of her work in trance. I'm just curious, I worked in trance many times. I've done extensive writing, poetry as well as trance work. And I also studied writers such as Ramana Maharishi and Hindus of that nature. It seems to me that there seems to be some substratum of reality that escapes our capacity for knowing that somehow or other does inform us. And the question I ask of you, in a world of quantum physics, when a particle could be two places simultaneously, it seems to me that materialism has its limits. Thank you.
Would someone in particular like to respond?
Should I try?
I mean, I could.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
So, I think materialism has its limits if you misconstrue what materialism means. So all materialism says about what you just said is that there's some explanation, there's a physical explanation for why it is you were feeling what you were feeling. Materialism doesn't say that we can know everything or that we can understand everything or that everything is going to be accessible to conscious thought. But it does suggest that if we had put you in a scanner, we might have seen something change in your brain when you were meditating versus not meditating, which in fact has been seen. We don't quite understand what happens yet. But I don't think that anything that you said is a refutation of the materialist view. And I should also mention that materialism, as we mean it, is not the same as the Marxist dialectical materialism. So, go ahead. Did you want to add?
As an ex-physicist who studied quantum physics a little bit, I guess I would add that despite all the spookiness of quantum physics, and it's very bizarre, I think quantum physicists would consider it, in a sense, a type of materialism, in that there are rules that seem to govern the behavior of quantum systems. But it's certainly a type of reality that's different from the way reality had been thought about previously.
And I guess I just wanted to echo Jonathan's view. I don't think there's anything about the materialist or physicalist worldview that needs to undermine wonder. I mean, the more I learn about how the brain works, the more amazing I think it all is. And it's not a kind of either science or spirituality or appreciation. I don't think there's any real. There's no opposition there, really.
Yeah, false dichotomy.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Graziano, do you think consciousness is a uniquely human brain phenomenon?
That's an excellent question. First, I would say, as I said in my short piece, I don't think it's really known what consciousness is. There are a lot of good ideas, and there's a particular idea that I very briefly outlined that I think is more plausible than some of the other ones, but nothing obviously is known for certain about it. If this particular theory is correct, and that's a big if consciousness is machinery that evolved to make us socially capable, to understand other people's minds, that's used on ourselves to understand our own minds, if that's true, then any animal with highly developed social capability is probably conscious. Is a bug conscious? No. Is an alligator conscious? Probably not. Is a dog conscious? Almost certainly. In that theory, because dogs have excellent social perceptual abilities in some way similar to humans. Could a computer be conscious if you programmed in that particular type of algorithm? In theory, yes. So, but that's only in the context of this one particular theory, which is far from certain and may never be certain.
Yes, ma'am.
As I haven't heard any of you speak on the role of language in promoting to this sense of duality. What role does language have in creating this sense of our self-awareness?
Oh, did you want me to expand a little bit on that? Yeah. Only that there is a view that has been proposed of consciousness, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, meaning the brain produces it and it floats there, but it doesn't do anything. We're aware of ourselves, but we can't actually control our actions in any way using our consciousness. The body mechanically does stuff, and we falsely think that we're consciously controlling it. And this idea of an epiphenomenon has a fatal flaw, and the fatal flaw is that we can talk about our consciousness and describe it, and therefore our speech, which is after all behavior, is under the influence of whatever that thing is that we call consciousness. So my point was simply that this particular view, which has been expressed by some scientific and philosophical points of view, this view of consciousness as epiphenomenon, as the useless mist that hangs over the head and is aware of us but has no role in controlling us, that can't be true simply because of our ability to talk about consciousness. So that's really what I meant by that.
Any other comments on language?
The language, So the scientist Gazzaniga has a really interesting view of well, it's really a view of consciousness, that we build a story about ourselves. In some ways, it's similar to the view I described. We construct a story, we tell ourselves a story about ourselves. And you can actually, the reason why he has that view is he studied patients who, for various medical reasons, had the two sides of their brain divided surgically. So the connections between the two sides of the brain were cut. This is called split brain patients. It's a very weird, nobody does this anymore. It was for epilepsy, to prevent it from spreading across. But now epilepsy is much better controlled by modern drugs. So there was a set of patients in the mid part of the 20th century who had this procedure, and then they were tested by many people, including Gazzaniga. And it turns out that language, the ability to speak, is concentrated mainly in the left hemisphere, not the right hemisphere. So if you ask someone's right hemisphere to do something, and then you ask someone's left hemisphere, why did you do that? Well, the left hemisphere doesn't know. It has no access to that information anymore. But it doesn't seem to care. It just makes up a story. And this is what happens. The person says, oh, I did that because this and that. And you ask, well, are you confident that that's why you did it? Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. So this is, to Gazzaniga, and I think this is reasonable, strong evidence that we construct a verbal story about ourselves. And,
can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
This Gazzaniga research is very interesting. So with the split brains, they're in a lab, and the researcher knows that the brain is split and that the two hemispheres aren't communicating with each other. And the science, it's often not in a mean-spirited way, but the confabulation, the making up of stories that the split brains do is actually pretty comical usually. But they have these sort of extreme certainty, it's rock-jawed certainty in the fiction story they make up, even though to all the people in the lab, it's obviously a fiction story they're telling themselves. When they believe in with sort of rock-jawed certainty. Now, that research is interesting, but if it only applied to a few score of epileptics who had their brain severed, it would be it would have sort of the interest of the freak show. But it doesn't just apply to those people. Gazzaniga calls this part of the left brain the interpreter, and other people, myself included, have been calling it the story mind. This part of your mind that is responsible for making up the narratives, the stories that govern your existence, that takes all the raw data that's always rivering into your senses and threshes through it and organizes it and turns it into narratives that make sense. What's really interesting is that we all have these story minds. We're all making up these little fictions all the time. The problem is we're such extremely good confabulators that it's very hard to catch us in the act. So a great example of this is the one that Adina just gave, the socks example. This is a sort of famous study about mentally healthy, full brain, not split brain individuals confabulating. So you give them an array of socks, and there's 7 socks in the array, 7 pairs of socks in the array. And you say to the people, you can have a pair of these socks. Which pair would you like? They're all priced the same. So they go and they feel them, they look at them, they check out the stitching and so forth. And they say, okay, I like these socks. People choose their socks. And then you ask them why they chose the socks they choose. And they have wonderful stories about it. Quality of stitching, shades, textures, so on. Everything makes perfect sense. And they have, again, rock-jawed certainties in these lies they're telling to themselves. And the trick is that all 7 pairs of socks are exactly the same. They're exactly the same. And there is a reason they're choosing the socks they choose. There is some sort of weird bias in the brain that you tend to choose the socks on the right side of the array. But they have no access. Their brains have no access to that unconscious bias in their decision making. And so they make up a story about it. And there's all kinds of neat examples of this that psychologists are doing where they're able to manipulate conditions to get people to confabulate and make up these stories. But again, we're all doing it all the time. We just don't have, it's just very hard to catch us because they're so good at it. Yeah.
Adina, would you like to comment on the language or narrative question?
I think No, I'll save my comments for others.
Okay, so a hand here, please. Yes, sir.
Well, I guess to begin with, I direct this to Dr. Roskies and maybe the other panelists would have a comment too. But I'm interested in your comments about free will and the criminal law. And so my question is, to what extent do you think humans are hardwired with a moral sensibility? Certainly, as Dr. Gottschall mentions, I mean, if you've got mirror neurons that help you sympathetically identify with other people, that's going to contribute to a moral sense. But if I've got more of those neurons than the person next to me, am I going to be, again, is my brain going to be more capable of moral behavior than someone? Just whatever your thoughts are about that general question.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess the short answer, I would say, is yes, in general, we're hardwired to have some kind of moral sense. But there's variability among individuals in terms of how their brains are structured. There are certain kinds of developmental issues that are looking to be, clearly brain-based, like psychopathy, that seem to undermine this kind of moral sense. And my guess is that it can be trained. It can be, sort of ramped up or dampened down depending on experience. Like most of your brain it exhibits some kind of plasticity.
The nature versus nurture question.
Yeah, yeah.
Through stories and education and cultural.
Right. I mean, I think moral education is probably a really important thing. I also don't. I mean, I think a lot of the basics for morality are present in other primates, in other social species. Not that they, are sitting there thinking about what is the right and the good, but there are ways of interacting with conspecifics that are acceptable and other ones that aren't acceptable. I mean, my dog, when he plays with small dogs and they, sort of make any kind of ouch sound, he backs way off, So I don't think that we have it and nobody else has anything, but I think that, well, maybe this is where we should go back to language. I think because of our ability to objectify feelings in language and codify things and pass knowledge on verbally, we have a very different kind of or maybe level of moral behavior that is not accessible to other kinds of animals who lack those kinds of abilities. So, yeah, but I think that there's definitely a neural basis for moral behavior. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One last question.
I'm going to read my question so that I don't forget any parts of it. But it relates to the accounts of human subjectivity that underlie our ethical theories. And so, if we are storytelling creatures, how might ethical paradigms like virtue ethics and the ethics of care, which stress cultivation and practice, relationships and trust, intervene and enrich the aforementioned body elements? What happens if we know that the fat man is a father, a priest, that the 5 people are sex offenders, that the 1 person is a pregnant woman or your best friend? How could this open up more layered ways of looking at evaluation?
Yeah. Good question.
Well, thank you all for coming.
But that's what the scientists do. They start with the fat man example, and then they can vary in all sorts of ways and get at these questions you ask. What if that's what if one of those people was your child? Changes everything, obviously. Yeah. So, yeah, I think they are trying to tease out these differences.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that is coming out that seems so all of those things make a difference. One of the things philosophy tends to try to do is abstract away as much as possible and try to get to universal principles, but clearly in the way we live our lives, we don't do that all the time. Sometimes maybe we should, but it's not clear that we always should. And that, again, is a philosophical question that isn't, I think a lot of these philosophical questions are not ultimately going to be answered by any kind of science. The science bottoms out and you still have the question. But some interesting things that people are finding is that what you consider your in-group or your out-group makes a big difference. So if you if you have somebody and you give them a little questionnaire so you know what their political leanings are, and then you give them that kind of experiment, and you either tell them or insinuate that these people are, politically conservative. If that guy's a political conservative, he's more likely to save them, and then if they're liberal, and vice versa. If you prime people by making them think about their hair color, and the hair color is the same. I mean, what you consider in-group and out-group is incredibly flexible and manipulable, so you can make somebody, give them the very same scenario, and just because they, both have college degrees, they're in-group, or because they have the same first name, they're in-group. So these things are all under the level of conscious awareness of the person, but they affect the way that they make these moral choices. And so the real question, it's clear that those kinds of influences are there, and I think that the more interesting question then to think about is, well, what then is the right thing to do? Which of these factors should be considered ethically relevant and which not, and how can we construct the world in such a way that we can get people to consider their in-group to be probably as wide as possible, right? So my guess is, we're going to have this anti-Islamic feeling until there's something like a Martian, right? As soon as the Martians come, the Islamic world will be our friends, right? So the real challenge is, how do we get people to think about the Martians in the absence of the Martians, right? How do we get our in-group to include everybody?
Well, on this wonderful note about the human significance of practicing neuroscience, and thank you very much, Amy, for that question. We'll close our formal. Thank you, panel. Thank you very much.